Hello, my name is Brent Bollert. Today I will be providing a primer on the climate scenarios used in the Enhancing the Climate Resilience of Africa's Infrastructure study. We will begin with a background on the climate change scenarios used in the study and then move on to talking about how we typically downscale and bias correct general circulation models. So we'll begin with a brief background on general circulation models, or GCMs for short. These climate models simulate global climate patterns, and they involve equations and parameters that represent physical relationships within the meteorological system. There are over 23 models from international research institutes, which we'll see a couple of on the next slide. And the outputs from these models range widely. They're meteorological variables, including precipitation and temperature. Those are probably the two most well known when it comes to climate model projections. This diagram off to the right is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and demonstrates the 3D nature of these models. So this simply depicts over Europe these 3D grids going up into the atmosphere and down into the ocean in order to appropriately capture the types of circulation effects that need to be captured in these models. So they're fairly sophisticated. Changes in climate projections are based on greenhouse gas emission scenarios, and we'll also talk about that in a later slide. In the data warehouse, we have a total of 56 model runs that were generated using scenarios developed in 2007 by the IPCC, and then an additional 65 model runs that used scenarios developed in 2013 by the IPCC. This table shows the different general circulation models that were developed as part of the 2007 IPCC effort and their country of origin. And as can be seen, there's a wide variety of different countries where these models have been produced, ranging from Asia to Australia to Europe to North America. Now next we'll talk about greenhouse gas emission scenarios. These are the crucial drivers of climate change, of human-driven climate change. And there are two primary sets that we employ in this study and also in the data warehouse, in the model runs that are provided in the data warehouse. The first is from the IPCC fourth assessment, which was done in 2007. And these are called Special Report on Emission Scenarios storylines. And these are depicted by this tree-like structure off to the right, which has these driving forces down at the roots and global, economic, environmental, and regional drivers up in the limbs of the tree. We specifically focus on three of these socioeconomic scenarios. Now, these produce specific emissions trajectories and differ from what we'll talk about in a moment, the representative concentration pathways, because they are not actually stabilization scenarios. These are simply storylines that are generated and then produce a specific series of emissions outcomes resulting from that storyline, so different than a stabilization scenario. The A2 storyline is regionally oriented economic development and tends to be a relatively high emissions scenario. The A1B is relatively balanced among the 2007 SRES scenarios. This is a balanced emphasis on all energy sources. The B1 scenario is a relatively low emissions outcome. Here we see a global environmental sustainability focus, and that's what we get out of that B1 set of runs. Now in 2013, the focus was changed to these representative concentration pathways. The goal of these pathways was essentially to, instead of constructing a storyline, instead a stabilization scenario, meaning emissions stabilized by 2100 at different levels, and the storyline could be manifold. There could be many different storylines that corresponded to a specific RCP scenario. The goal of these scenarios was to establish stabilization runs that could be used to evaluate benefits of different mitigation outcomes, in a sense. There are two different RCPs that we focus on here. The first is 4.5, and that's the units on that is watts per square meter. It's a unit of atmospheric forcing. And the stabilization target by 2100 is 650 parts per million of CO2 equivalents. RCP 8.5, which is 8.5 watts per square meter of forcing, stabilizes at 1350 parts per million. So a much, much higher outcome, which results in much larger increases in temperature, as can be seen on the graphic to the right. Now, when we think about a climate data processing approach, we begin by identifying and gathering historical temperature and precipitation data. This is the first step. And in this particular analysis, because we needed a daily gridded climate data set, we used data from the Princeton Land Surface Hydrology Modeling Group, which is available daily at a half-degree resolution for the entire globe. So this was our daily data set that we employed. And that historical data set is available from 1948 to 2008 in the case of this particular data set. We then moved on to process the IPCC General Circulation Model projections in precipitation and temperature. And this involved downloading data directly from the archive, from the IPCC archive in raw form, and then taking that information and processing it into a form that could be used in the procedure we'll describe here. We then select some or all of those scenarios for further analysis. In this case, because of the fact that we're focused on trying to capture as broad a range of climate models as possible, we actually include all of the scenarios. All of the runs that we downloaded are included in this data set that are available for download on the data warehouse. Lastly, we use the historical data to bias correct and spatially downscale these model projections. Now, those are the two important pieces here. General circulation models have bias in them, and they also require spatially downscaling in order to be compatible with the types of analyses that we want to conduct in these types of studies. We'll begin by talking about bias correction, and then we'll move on to discussing the spatial disaggregation and downscaling approach. To bias correct climate data in any type of climate projection, we need three different data sets. The first is an observed data set. The second is a GCM baseline or a hindcast. And the third is a general circulation model projection. Now, the observed baseline it's necessary that that be available for a period of at least 30 years in order to do appropriate bias correction based on the statistics of that history. In our case, the Princeton data set is available from 1950 through 1999. It's actually through 2008, but we truncated at 1999, and we use that 1950 to 1999 period for the bias correction. Now, this data can be station or gridded. In our case, it is gridded at a half-degree resolution, and it's typically considerably higher spatial resolution than the GCM data sets. Now, the GCM baseline, or the modeled history, also known as the hindcast, is typically available from 1870 or even earlier to the present. And the difference between these two, the statistical differences between the mean and the standard deviation and other moments, is referred to as model bias. And if we look across a wide range of different GCMs and compare that to what actually happened historically, we'll oftentimes see significant model bias. And the goal of the bias correction process is to address this model bias and try and true up the GCM projections such that they are statistically consistent with the observed baseline. So this last piece here that we need is this projections from the GCMs into the future. This is the modeled future. It's typically available from the present to 2100 or beyond. The difference between the GCM baseline and the GCM projections is the delta or the ratio. This is the change that's actually projected by the GCM. So what we're trying to do with our bias correction methodology is adjust the GCM series such that the delta or the ratio, the change is actually maintained, but the time series of future projections is made so that it's consistent with what we've observed historically. That's essentially what we were trying to do. We employed a methodology called bias correction and spatial disaggregation. More information is available in the appendices of the ECRI report on this topic, but that's the approach that we used in this particular study, and more information is available for those who are interested in that. Next, we'll talk about downscaling. So the goal of downscaling is to map low-resolution GCM signals to a finer resolution. And just to illustrate this point as a start, off on the right side of this slide, we see a map of the Horn of Africa. And this shows river basins, which are the colored shapes, light gray lines, and dark black lines. The light gray lines are half-degree resolution grid cells. So there are 10,639 of those over the African continent. The dark black lines on top of those light gray lines are 2-degree by 2-degree resolution grid cells. So those are the approximate resolution of many of the GCMs that are actually downscaled directly from the IPCC archive. And our goal in this operation is to map the GCM resolution from that 2-degree by 2-degree resolution, which as you can see is fairly coarse, down to a half-degree by half-degree resolution using information available through the observed data set. So the challenge with any approach that we might take is that it does introduce additional uncertainty. And that's just an important side note. It requires a fairly extensive quantification of GCM sensitivities and assumptions. So when we're talking about doing really detailed dynamic downscaling type of operations, it's rarely possible to run more than a few types of climate scenarios. This argument lends itself to doing a simpler approach to downscaling, which is what we've adopted. So we've adopted a more straightforward approach to the downscaling procedure, and as a result, it has enabled us to downscale a very large number of GCM models, which we include on the data warehouse. So what are the three options? And this is in decreasing order of complexity. So the first is called dynamic downscaling. This is where we use a regional climate model to actually take characteristics within a given grid cell of a GCM and develop, in a sense, a model within a model to model the regional climate within that grid cell and downscale it that way. It's very sophisticated and very, very labor and time intensive, and as noted above, difficult to do for more than 1 or 2 runs, perhaps. The next approach is called statistical downscaling. And this actually uses empirical relationships between the observed baseline and the characteristics of the GCMs themselves to develop these downscaled relationships. Now, this is an approach we use for a subset of the GCMs, and this was developed by the University of Cape Town. The last technique is a spatial technique, and this is simply taking the pattern of the GCM and replicating it using some kind of a geometric technique or some kind of a mathematical approach. Inverse distance weighting is the technique that we employed here. So this red box shows the 2 different approaches that we employed, the first being statistical downscaling. Those were 22 model runs from the University of Cape Town, and the remainder used inverse distance weighting, which essentially smooths differences across these grid cells, going from 2 degrees by 2 degrees, or perhaps even higher, down to half-degree by half-degree. So to summarize what we've covered in this primer, we first began with a background on general circulation models and on emission scenarios. We talked about how one goes about processing climate data and bias correcting it. And then we talked about different downscaling approaches that are available. Thank you for your time.